Hi everyone, and welcome back to ThursDev. My name is Luke, and it's October, and you know what that means. It's Horror Month. Like many of our video making contemporaries, we will also be focusing on some Halloween-esque content this month for a little bit of a change of pace and to get into the spirit of the season. Like many young people with older siblings, I was a kid who was exposed to horror movies, not specifically when I personally wanted to start exploring that particular corner of film, but when my older brother began watching them, that meant that I did too. As he's only 2 years my senior, I was mentally still able to cope with a lot of the horror that we ended up watching together, but I was still a little kid, and some movies like The Thing and Alien scared the juvenile piss out of me. And as is the case with many mildly traumatic experiences, what started as a fear, once reconciled, turned into a fascination, and into my adulthood, I've become something of a connoisseur of horror films and video games alike. And that brings me to the topic of today's video. Though there are a lot of games that exist using horrific theming, it's extremely difficult to create a video game that hits the mark precisely when attempting to capture the essence of horror. We have a lot of horror games on the market. They're something of a staple of video gaming in general now, but most of them are not really that frightening. Due to games being an interactive medium, player agency makes horror a much more difficult to achieve thing than film or the written word. Doom 1 and Doom 2 were tense and action-packed and stressfully scary in their day from the perspective of a kid trying not to get eaten by imps and cacodemons at 2 a.m., but at heart it was far more of an action game with horror theming than a true horror experience. Dead Space does a fantastic job of creating a terrifying narrative and is a damn stressful game to play through if you're really motivated not to die. In most ways, it's a strong horror game, but it suffers from the unfortunate issues of power creep relatively earlier on and, like Doom, relies mostly on jump scares to provide its fright, and asks the player to spend their time fighting enemies to progress, as opposed to survive in a horrific scenario, which is why many horror game proponents are still reluctant to call it a true horror game, as much as it is a very scary action game, which has a distinction. Honestly, though there are some games classified as horror, the problem with most is that they aren't really putting the player in the shoes of a real horror story protagonist. Aside from the 1995 classic horror adventure game Clock Tower, which checked a very good number of the right boxes, there have been very few games that really focus not on the horror aspect of a horror game, but the terror of them. This is why it was a real coup when Amnesia: The Dark Descent was released back in 2010. What did it truly do right? I aim to answer those questions and provide some mechanical context today as to how we as designers might help leverage and exploit the human psyche in creating truly terrifying games. What though do I mean when I talk about terror as opposed to horror in the literary sense? The distinction between the two comes as far back as the early 1800s with Gothic literature and a writer named Anne Radcliffe, who posited that terror is related to obscurity and uncertainty, that sick realization of something profoundly wrong, where horror is a reaction to displays of atrocity, the feeling of revulsion that usually occurs after something frightening is seen, heard, or otherwise experienced. Horror in the literary context is that adrenaline rush that follows the act. Of the two, many literary greats seem to be in agreement that terror is the purest and most gratifying, creating a sense of internalized dread in the person experiencing it, not because they're currently dealing with a horrifying situation, but because they're on edge and ready for one to occur. Some of the greatest sources of fear that we can conjure up come from within the observer's mind itself, which is why Ridley Scott's Alien of 1979 is such a marvel of horror film. In stark contrast to its sequel, helmed by action director John Cameron, the original Alien leverages true terror to motivate its viewer. Although it was more of a response to the logistical impracticality of showing the alien itself moving around on screen if rumors are to be believed, we rarely see the eponymous xenomorph over the course of the film, and when we do, with exception to the movie's climax, you know it's because someone is about to die. The film is slow, deliberate in its pacing, and plays out as much like a twisted Agatha Christie play as it does a thriller, members of the crew disappearing one after the other. Although we get our dose of body horror from the iconic chestburster scene, the bulk of the film is not glamour shots of a scary monster eviscerating people, but of people experiencing true terror, unable to know when the creature will appear, and when one of them will disappear. The difficulty with engendering terror in one's audience as a game designer, however, is that unlike film, which is an entirely passive experience, we expect the player to participate in the experience as a video game. They need to interact with the game world we provide for them, and we need to provide them a means by which they can survive to the end. This is a difficult balance to achieve, of course. In a game where you're pitted against a foe and must have some method by which to survive an encounter with them, most designers seem to default to giving the player a weapon. It's a sensible choice, of course. Games are, generally speaking, seen as a power fantasy, and at some point, somewhere, a player is going to want to feel empowered, especially an adrenaline junkie who plays horror games. If a player is unable to fight at all, that takes much of the power out of the hands of the player, and conventional wisdom tells us that creating an unwinnable situation is wrong. But the issue with empowering the player when attempting to create terror is that eventually they'll start to feel safety. Under the right circumstances, granting the player a moment's respite to catch their breath and feel some semblance of safety is valuable. Enough stress will make most players eventually have to turn their game off, but it should be managed safety. A room with an unbreachable door that is simultaneously too far from their objective. A fire that the monsters won't get too close to. Safety should be a static object that the player can't bring with them, because at some point, if the player has a trusty gun and enough bullets, even the scariest boss becomes significantly less scary. The greatest gift you can give to your players as a horror game creator is the gift of helplessness. Amnesia: The Dark Descent forces you to run from your foes. It teaches you that hiding in a dark cupboard is your method for safety, and that the creatures are to be avoided at all costs. It's effective because the player has a method of escaping through reasonably reliable hiding, while still forcing the player to forge onward. Take away the player's ability to deal with the problem head-on, and don't allow them to feel like a hero, leaving them vulnerable and at the mercy of the game itself, and you begin to create terror. Because just the act of encountering the monsters, whatever it may be, can lead to death. The player has to feel a certain paranoia, and ideally begin searching for those static points of safety, as opposed to counting bullets. On the topic of bullet counting as well, we can look to games like Resident Evil, a masterpiece of the survival horror genre, though again not truly a terrifying experience, in the way that they manufacture helplessness in the player through an economy of scarcity. Limited bullets, limited healing, even limited save opportunities. Certain things can be learned from experiencing the survival horror genre in ways that they can cause panic in the player, but ultimately everything still becomes a matter of knowing how much capacity you have for dealing with a threat and stockpiling if you don't have enough. You're constantly dealing with emerging threats, but you aren't experiencing real terror because the shambling zombies and the other monsters were, for better or worse, a known quantity, and they were defeatable. Alien's most recent video game counterpart, Alien Isolation, is a beautiful rejection of the idea of a monster that you can deal with. The xenomorph is pure terror because all you can do about it is to have an idea where it is and not be there. Yes, there are other survivors out there who will want to kill you for some reason, but they're window dressing, and generally speaking, they need to be avoided as well. The alien in Alien Isolation makes you vulnerable, helpless. The other thing that it does that allows the terror to really coalesce is that it's unpredictable and unrelenting. The game's AI is sophisticated enough that the alien appears to be actively stalking you and others instead of being just some standard patrolling schlub like you will encounter in most games. In the average action game, it's a rare occurrence to see an enemy that's entirely persistent, not just in the manner that they remain in place if they're avoided, that's common enough, but that they doggedly track the player. And a level change or entering a door isn't enough to put it behind you. In many games that emphasize stealth, an enemy will even frequently give up if the player spends enough time avoiding them, and only the enemies that are meant to be truly terrifying, like the regenerating necromorph of Dead Space, ever really follows the player without ceasing. It also serves as one of the key central mechanics of the game. Though the player doesn't actively engage with the AI of the game on a personal level, its high volume of decision-making and reactionary problem-solving make it a worry that's unique to the genre, an enemy that can perhaps be foiled, temporarily, but that actively attempts to deal with being foiled, making it another active participant in the game, as opposed to just something that the player has to get beyond. That thought that it may be following you, or even toying with you, is a great way to induce a sense of paranoia. Unlike the scripted boss monster events of many of the games of the genre, the Alien and Alien Isolation is a mostly constant threat that you can't always account for, but are always scrambling to be prepared to deal with. Dead Space was also remarkable in its ability to create paranoia in the player by having seemingly dead monsters that would spring to life and attack Isaac if he blundered close to them, meaning that the player would either try at all costs to avoid monster corpses, even to the point of personal detriment, or to waste ammo dismembering any corpse that they encountered. With the persistent threat, moment to moment, you need to be situationally aware, fully immersed in the game experience in order to effectively deal with this threat with all of your senses. By ensuring that the game is reliant on all the tools at the player's disposal, the designer can capture those senses and invest the player enough to really start getting into the player's head. Sound design to this end is also imperative, as not only can it be one of the better tools you can offer to your players for dealing with threats, but can also serve as a wonderful tool for creating that much more tension by creating a soundscape to both lead and deter your players. Ultimately, in the creation of a video game where the primary goal is more than to entertain, but to make the player to experience terror through their interaction with your game, you should attempt as much as possible to engage every sense that you can, and with games, audio and video are our only tools. Three-dimensional sound, audio modeling, and smart sound effect choices can all contribute to a sublime terror experience, as can smart decisions in lighting and even level design. One last element to creating terror, however, the designer of a horror game should also provide what I'll refer to as incidental challenges. Distractions from the central terror of the game that will, if properly leveraged, create even more tension as the player needs to balance accomplishing side goals while still keeping that seed of survival need in the back of their mind. I don't necessarily advocate for the usage of obtuse inventory puzzles like Resident Evil, and key puzzles are hackneyed, but needing to activate a generator somewhere past a known danger area, or having to choose whether to help someone or not, those create a sense of urgency beyond that of just surviving. If a player's only motivation is to get from point A to point B, and not die to the constant threat of a singular enemy, the experience can become stale, and the terror can quickly devolve into stress. Counterintuitively, though the designer's job is to instill fear in the player, the fear needs to be a managed trickle that can be throttled up or down when appropriate, as opposed to a constant stream. The player, regardless of their own interest in the game, still needs to feel like the story's protagonist, instead of as a hapless victim. Giving them goals, even though the overarching one should always be survive the night, is the key to creating a truly memorable experience. The horror sim genre, which includes Amnesia, Slender and Alien Isolation, may not necessarily be the be-all and end-all of horror games, as each player has their own likes and dislikes, but to actually allow the player to experience fear and terror, perhaps is the closest thing that we currently have. Even outside the genre, helplessness, uncertainty, paranoia, and urgency are some of the most potent tools of the trade if the designer wants to really, truly scare their players. Are you a horror aficionado as well? If you've played any games recently that really scared you, let us know in the comments below and tell us what really made it frightening for you. I'm always on the lookout for another game to fear quit. In the meantime though, thank you as always for coming by, it's always a pleasure. Stay tuned next week for more Horror Month ThursDev, there's a lot left to say. Also hit that subscribe button if you want YouTube to let you know when it's going to be ready. And otherwise, thank you as always for coming by, and I hope that I'll see you again next time. Take care.